Good evening. I'm going to read the short story, The 12 Stitches of Christmas. Here is the cover, which you can see. A little bit of a story behind the 12 Stitches of Christmas. This story I was on deadline for with my publisher, and the day that it was due at midnight, I received word that one of my other publishing houses was closing, and it was a big blow because I had no warning, of course, and I thought things were fine there. I had just completed a novella that I'd written for their anthology, which was raising funds for several veterans organizations, and that story was checkout. The story had been edited and was ready to go to print. We were getting ready to do our promos and everything was all set, and suddenly we got the notice that the doors were closing and that book would never be out. And I was very upset, and I didn't have my short story done. I was trying to finish it and write it, and I was very upset, and it wasn't going well, and the timing was wrong. And a friend of mine who had been one of my advisors for fight scenes and gunfights, he offered to help me finish the story. Without his help, the story would not have been completed. I was too upset to finish it, and deadline was looming. We finished the story. He came over, he brought chocolate, and we finished that story, wrote it together, and sent it at 12 midnight on the dot. I can honestly say I have never missed a deadline in my life, and Robert Arrow, my co-author of The 12 Stitches of Christmas, helped me to complete that story, and I'm very thankful for that. The story will drop off contract this year, and our rights will revert to us, and then I'll probably figure out a way to put it out again. You can't put a short story into print because they're not long enough. You need 100 pages to go to print. But the ebook could be out, or it could go into an anthology somewhere of Christmas stories perhaps, or fairy tale type stories. It is a fairy tale type romance, and it's a Christmas one. So, once again, The 12 Stitches of Christmas. Here we go. Chapter 1. Tears nearly blinded 10-year-old Carolina from where she hid behind the old elm tree in the forest. She blinked hard several times to clear her vision in order to see what her new guardian was doing. Her uncle's foul mood had increased with each hour this evening, and her left cheek still stung from where he'd backhanded her before stalking from the town of Land's March straight into the dark forest. The full moon sent light through the trees to illuminate Uncle Trad, who walked in a circle, spreading the buckthorn herb with his hand. He muttered some words she didn't understand, while the scowl of his dark brow deepened. He looked like a bear in the dark, a large, fierce black bear hunched over to spread the herb, his words coming out like a low growl. What is he doing? He completed the circle and then stood in sight of it, muttering. She didn't know what to make of him, this uncle she'd only met for the first time 4 days ago at her mother's funeral, who was now behaving so strangely. This uncle her mother had never spoken of frightened her. She longed for mother, or for the mysterious father who had ridden to war and never returned. If only Father would come and find her here and take her away from Uncle. But Uncle had made it clear no one was coming for her. Your parents are dead, he said. No one was ever coming for her. She had to live with him now. He was very angry about that, like a bear growling. An old bent-over woman holding a staff stepped out from the trees and moved into the circle behind Uncle's back. He turned and, seeing her, pointed his finger as he shouted, "Halt and grant my boon." The black-haired woman with a skunk-like white streak down her hair laughed a dirty-toothed laugh, every wrinkle in her brown prunish face deepening. "Command me not, ye spineless tailor," she cackled once, then pointed her long, gnarled finger back at him and shook it. He took a step backward as if realizing it might not be wise to anger one of the Fey folk, if she were Fey. "Good granny, I but ask for aid to feed the girl who is now my ward. My tailor's shop barely brings enough coin to feed myself." The old woman paused, considering his words and him. After a glance into the forest, right to where Carolinia hid, she nodded and then spoke. "Tell me your boon, then, mad trad Penitch, and be quick about it." "A magic spell to make my tailor's shop successful beyond measure." "Ye ask for more than to feed the girl, 'tis riches you want." Trad nodded once. "I care not for you, Trad Penitch, but for the girl and the memory of her dear departed mother, this boon ye shall have." Stamping her cane upon the ground, she spat over her left shoulder. The ground rumbled. Trees shook. Carolinia wrapped her arms around the elm she hid behind, wanting to close her eyes in fear, but too afraid of the scene before her to look away from the magic and her mad uncle. Her soft child's cheek pressed against the rougher bark of the tree as she hung onto it, watching. A crack of lightning lit the sky, followed by a loud boom, which made her jump and then hug the tree even tighter. The wizened woman stood with her hand outstretched, untroubled, muttering. Then with a sudden poof, a vial of greenish-brown liquid appeared in her hand. Holding it up to be seen beneath the full moon's light, she said, "Drink this, and do as I say, and your hands will sew quicker than the fairest of the Fae, sewing every night but not the day. Drink it now and drink it quick, for to drink slow makes the drinker sick. If all this you will do, the wealth of measurement shall come to you. Thus Trad the tailor will find treasure and wealth beyond measure." She handed him the vial, and he looked at the disgusting-looking potion with a grimace. "You want me to drink this? If you do not do as I say, misfortune will also come your way." Taking the vial, he raised it to his lips and sipped. The woman moved back into the forest, making no comment. He tried to swallow and gag before spitting it out. "Vile potion, must you curse me too? First the child, and now this." The child had to be referring to her, to Carolinia, wanting to be away before he realized she had followed him. She took a step backward and stepped on a twig, which snapped, the noise carrying across to where he stood. She froze. fury in his gaze, which pinned her to the spot. Trad paced toward her. "Girl," he roared, and grabbed her arm, forcing her down upon the forest floor and onto her back. "No, Uncle, please," she cried, using her other arm to hide behind, cringing from what she thought would be another blow to her face. Then his knee was upon her chest to where she could hardly breathe, and his hand forced her head back and her jaw open. He began to pour the foul-tasting potion into her mouth and down her throat. "Swallow this down, and swallow it all. None in the town shall hear you call. Labor by night and sleep by day. Keep out of sight and hidden away. For you shall earn every bit of your keep. My obligation to meet, no longer burdened by my sister's child, who shall remain meek, modest, and mild," he chanted. She gagged upon the thick foul liquid, but he forced her head back further, and holding her nose made her swallow every single drop. Burning, her throat was burning and raw with heat. Her breathing labored as she gasped for air, cooling air to ease her pain. He moved off of her and stood scowling down at her, his hands at his hips. "Water, wine, anything to stop the burning, please." She reached out to him to implore him, trying to speak, to beg for something cool to drink. Her mouth and tongue moved as if normal, past the burning pain, yet not even the smallest, lowest whisper of a word floated past her lips. Alarmed, she tried again. Then she screamed, a silent scream that raised not a sound in the forest. Carolinia, the girl with the sweetest songbird voice in the village, had lost the ability to sing. Hot tears rolled down her face as she mouthed, "What have you done to me?" Uncle Trad laughed and moved off toward the village, throwing his words over his shoulder. "Get home and to bed, wench." From that day on, though she was but a child, not even a half-grown girl, he would only call her wench, never by her own name. The rest of the townsfolk would soon learn not to address her at all. From the shelter of the forest trees, the old woman stood with narrowed eyes watching all this happen, and as Trad left for his tailor's shop, in Land's March she muttered one more incantation, one which none would hear save herself, and those fae which were near enough. Once muttered, she stirred the leaves upon the forest floor until, swirling, they rose up into the air and over to where the girl lay, before floating down upon her. Through her tears and her pain, Carolinia watched the leaves fall, leaves seeming to dance upon the wind, lightly brushing her face, then falling to the earth again. Leaves that whispered like the wind, without word or song, such a whisper to creep into her soul. Soon after, she rose from beneath the leaves to return to her uncle's shop, slowly placing one small foot after another. Carolinia blinked back her tears. Tears would do nothing to hold back the darkness outside the thick-paned windows of the tailor's shop, her heart's sadness or the strong push of the magic. Uncle Trad piled more red and gold cloth onto the table. 12 days till Christmas. Make 2 more doublets like the last one. I want to be sure we have plenty of garments on hand. She looked at the stack of cloth sitting next to her, and her shoulders sagged at the addition of more work, but she nodded with no expression, simply threaded a needle to prepare, obedient as always. He smirked, pleased with himself. 12 more days. Christmas is the best time of year. As the magic began to flow through her, he nodded and then climbed the stairs to his room. She did not watch him go, but sat with eyes closed, wishing the magic would stop for just one night. But such a wish never did her any good. Pulled into the magic, she lost all sense of day and time. Carolinia pricked her finger for the 5th time that evening. She fought back her tears. Fingers sore, the pricked one now bleeding, she sewed on into the night because she had no choice. Uncle Trad would find her in the morning when the sun rose, collapsed over a pile of garments which were fully completed and perfect in their intricacy. Never a stitch out of place, never an error, and sewn faster than any normal human could sew. But then none had ever called her normal, certainly not Uncle Trad. She sewed on into the night, remembering the day had forced the vile liquid down her throat, that horrible green liquid which had burned her songs away and stolen her voice. From that night on, her life changed. The years had run one into the other. Now she was near her 16th birthday and had outgrown the black gowns she was forced to wear. Despite the fact her fingers could nimbly sew any sort of dress she wanted, Trad would only provide her with black cloth, never even a touch of color. Sometimes she thought he'd like to black her out of his life entirely, the way night took away the light of the sun. Tonight she sat in her black dress sewing. When her work for the night was done, she would remove her dress, wash it, and hang it by the kitchen fireplace to dry while she slept in her thin white nightgown. It was her only dress. She'd cover the sleeve edges and the neckline of the dress with embroidered songbirds of every color thread. If she could no longer play beneath the trees singing along with the birds as she had when she was a child, she could at least have these reminders of the birds and their singing. When Trad woke her, saying, "Get up, wench, time to work," she would don the dress again, and her day would begin all over again, every day being the same, in an endless repetition of the others. The only change was the clothing she sewed, the colors, and sometimes her embroidery. In this her spirit was free, her fingers flying, the stitches full of beauty and color. Her work for the night completed, she placed it upon the sewing table and then crawled into her bed behind the heavy drape, which split her sleeping area from the rest of the building. Uncle Trad, who'd kept the upstairs room for himself, was overhead snoring. Carolinia's sleeping area was only big enough for her, her bed, and a small table beside it, where her glass of water rested. In her small sleeping area, she felt safe. It was the only place she was safe from her uncle, the only place she could escape the day to day and night to night of her life, within her dreams, where once again she sang among the birds of the forest. Closing her eyes, she sent up the wish of her heart. Please let me be heard, even just once, by someone who cares about me. That's all I want for Christmas, just once. Chapter 2. Arden urged his horse on. The horse, in his indomitable plodding, stumbled and Arden's face fell. The poor beast had gone miles, but was clearly nearing the end of his energy, and Arden hated the thought of having pushed such a good horse so far. He would have to find some place to stay for the night. Not that there were many places to stop along the road, but the signs said he was getting closer to some particular village. Hopefully he could resupply there. He could relax, let the horse rest, and take care of some much-needed maintenance. The memory of his last encounter and the damage incurred made him scowl as he rode. A cloak was not a particularly precious thing, but it had done right by him these many years, having been a gift from his knighthood. The thought of it damaged had him seething. Of course it had been worth it, and that helped. The ogre that had plagued the lands he had just left was dead now, and the people could rest safely. He could withstand a gash or two in his clothes if it meant he could help poor farm folk. The horse stumbled again, and Arden grew worried. He imagined the poor thing was not only tired, but losing sight of the ground for the encroaching darkness. Shelter was something he'd have to find soon, even if it meant a campfire and using his saddle as a pillow again like back in the war. He shuddered. Barely 2 years after being knighted, he'd been called away. Even now he still had no idea why the man he fought for was fighting with the man he fought against. Arden knew neither their names nor circumstances. It had been like fighting faceless phantoms. The experience had been good for him, though, and he learned much about combat and strategy that mere lessons and practice could not have given him. He almost smiled. 5 years ago, he would never have thought a country bumpkin like him would know how to fight, manage a thief, dance, ride, or even wear armor properly. If it hadn't been for that rotten acquaintance of his, he probably would have been content to spend the rest of his life knowing he'd be buried 50 yards from the spot where he'd been born. But instead, a 14-year-old girl caught the eye of Arden's 19-year-old acquaintance. When he tried to force himself on her, Arden had intervened. It had been a tough scuffle, the results of which were bruises and a broken lip for Arden and broken ribs and eventual death for the other man. The whole thing probably would have ended there if the girl had not been the daughter of nobility. So Arden was made a knight and trained in the ways of knighthood and called to fight. Now here he was, traveling home. A light glimmered in the gloom ahead, and Arden's heart lifted. Even if it was nothing more than a fire, he could at least get directions to where the rest could be had. The light turned out to be the glow of a boisterously loud cottage. Arden smiled at the sound of many children playing as he rode closer and eventually dismounted. He had just stepped inside the gate when the door opened and a tall, round woman stepped out, sighing mightily as the door closed behind her, and she sat down in a chair to rest. "Blasted husband of mine ain't worth the guinea he was born with." At that moment she looked up and saw Arden waiting patiently by the gate with the reins in his hand and grinning. She smiled back. "Hello, dearie, what can I be doing for you this time of night?" A child's shriek of extreme discontent made Arden wince. "Nothing of too much trouble, ma'am. Am I close to a village where I can find an inn for the night?" "You are, my lord," she replied. "Just keep following the road. I could walk there myself in about an hour." Arden bowed again with a smile. "Many thanks, my lady. Blessings on you and your home." He turned to leave, but stopped and turned back. "Out of curiosity, is there a tailor in town I might procure?" "There is indeed." The woman sat forward, excited. "Oh, my lord, if you have need of mending, you could do no better than to stop at the shop of Trad. He can have a full doublet ready and done for you in a single night, with embroidery to boot, and his stitches. I've never seen a man what can stitch like him." The sound of something breaking and a child's ensuing wail made her stop and close her eyes. "God give me strength." Chuckling, Arden thanked her and turned away, not bothering to remount his horse on his way to town. Once he reached the village of Land's March, he headed for the tailor's shop of Trad Penich, with the intention of having his good cloak mended. He'd reached the tailor's shop just as the shopkeepers in the village were closing up for the night. Tying the palomino to a tree in the front yard, he hurried to the door. Giving a short 2 raps and hearing no answer, he pushed on the door, opening it. "Hello?" Dim light inside from flickering candles showed him a girl. A slim girl in a white nightgown, bit down to the ground, picking something up. Long blonde hair covered her face until she raised her head to look straight into his eyes, her green eyes gazing at him through the strands of her silky hair. Like some skittish forest creature, she froze. Their gazes locked onto each other and held. A girl with green eyes, a beautiful girl. He leaned toward her, excitement and interest filling him as a large smile spread across his face. Her eyes lit in return. He glimpsed a marching flash of excitement and interest before she blushed and glanced back down, once again hidden behind her hair. Wench, who told you to open the door? I told you never to go out. A broad-shouldered man with a large belly hurried down the back stairs, bellowing. Seeing Arden, his expression quickly changed. My lord, beg pardon. Please come in. He hurried over to Arden. How may we serve you? To the girl, Trad pointed a silent, angry arm, telling her to get back. He stepped in front of her as she skittered backward. Arden tried to see the girl past the tailor's shoulders, but the portly man's body blocked her from view. Don't mind her, she's simple-minded, crawling about on her knees, searching the floor for what? He shook his head, tsk. Then he beamed a large smile. Now, what can I interest you in today? A new cloak? Nay, simply repair of this one. We have many mighty fine cloaks here, and we can custom fit one to you, unique among all others. Arden removed his cloak and handed it to the man. Just repair this one. When can it be ready? On the morrow, good sir. We work fast. Carolinia, listening from behind her blankets, had a moment of anger, the first she'd had in many years. Uncle Trad doesn't work fast. I do. He hasn't sewn a thing since the day he made me drink the green poison. He's lying. Uncle's good at lying. Everyone always believes him. A deep yearning for the handsome knight to know who really did the sewing for the shop, who really would be mending his cloak, filled her. Pressing her hands to her lips, a tear slipped out and ran down her cheek as she thought of her ruined throat. She could never tell him, never even attempt to, for then he would hear her noises and turn away. She longed so deeply for him to stay and not turn away. Never in her life had she had a longing like this one, wanting to speak to him, yearning for something she knew not what. She was drawn to the handsome knight like moth to a flame. His eyes had searched hers as if he wanted to know more. He did want to know more. She felt it within her bones. She would have spoken to him if she could, but she mustn't even try. No one would listen to her, repelled by the goosey sounds coming from her throat when she tried to speak. There was no one she could tell. Her story stayed locked inside these 6 years. It would stay locked for another 6. She dared not hope any more. The light in his eyes, which had searched hers, wanting to know more, that light would fade, and he would turn away, like all the others. None would ask about her, let alone ask her. It had been so long since any in the village had seen her, and none even knew her name. She curled into a ball as she always did before going to sleep, and would hide there in her comfort spot until the man left. Uncle will be angry. The biggest rule, to stay out of sight, had been broken. She stayed very still, knowing she would soon be punished. The men finished speaking, and she heard the handsome knight leave. Get to work, her uncle said. Only 11 days till Christmas. The handsome knight would be here on the morrow. She'd finish his cloak tonight. Never had the thought of sewing filled her with more pleasure. Every stitch, though driven by the magic, would carry her heartfelt blessings upon it. If I must be cursed, then I shall bless as well. This had been her creed for the last 2 years, this theme of blessing. The clothing she worked upon often carried forth blessings onto their wearers, blessings for mothers-to-be, for small children, and the aged. She could not speak, but she could pray, and what she prayed were prayers of blessing, always for others, never for herself. So, what will happen next with Carolinia and Arden? It's a Christmas story, and it's part of Lunchbox Shorts, 99 cents.